The WINS network is a global interagency network, and many of you who are joined here are very aware of it, but much you probably are not aware of is the many streams that the network does work into. So advocacy, policy, monitoring, a lot of research and evidence building. Some recent research is going to be shared soon. Also work on gender, MHH, programming, knowledge management, and exchanges. And the learning exchange was one of the things shared earlier. Now, it is a group of about 345 members, partners to date. We have core group members, which you see here, and very pleased if your organization is interested in joining us. So please see the website for more details. And we're very pleased today to have members of the network presenting today. And this is one of the opportunities. A lot of the learning and sharing does come through the network. Great. Okay, so moving on. Next slide, please. So today's session will focus on 3 presentations, and it's all around the big questions and discussions that various organizations are having on system strengthening. And we will have a first presentation from Christine Pugh. She is a Stanford PhD candidate. She will share a presentation with us on the necessary conditions for sustainable water and sanitation service delivery. An excellent presentation, and I think a lot of insights you will get from there. Then we'll be followed to how is this kind of the lessons learned from the WINS Enabling Environment Matrix, and this will be done by Brooke, and Brooke will also kind of apply some of links very nicely into with Christina's presentation, and then a very sort of a practical application of the enabling environment matrix, which will be shown by how the Blue Schools, and Lucy Leclerc will show how the Blue Schools has used this framework to evaluate the Blue Schools and sort of what are the lessons learned as they go into a system strengthening, but also the phase 4 of their programs. And then we'll have some questions and exchanges. Actually, in between each of the presentations, you're welcome to, because it is called Chat, Listen, and Exchange. So you can please use the chat, introduce yourselves, ask questions. I will be, as a moderator, looking at the questions inside the chat box. You can also unmute and have the share your questions after each of the presentations. So yeah, so with that, let's begin. We have a full session. So I would love to introduce Christine Pugh. She is, as I mentioned, a PhD Stanford candidate, where she is actually studying a very interesting relationship between water, climate, and economic development. She has previously worked with the World Bank, and she's also worked with as the chief editor-in-chief for the Engineers Without Borders. And I love the report, the annual failure report, and has also compiled the environmental impact assessment for work with the Water Service Board in Lake Victoria in Kenya. And she holds a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from McGill University, yay, from Canada. And with that, we will play her presentation. She has so graciously stayed up to answer questions, so she will be joining us after the presentation. So with that, and I hope all is in order. So next slide, please. And over to Christina's presentation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Christine. I'm just going to share my slide now, and I hope you're looking at the right version. I am a senior PhD candidate at Stanford University in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department. I am here today to share some of the key findings from a systematic review that my team and I recently conducted. And perhaps more importantly, I'm here to discuss some of the implications of our work for how we can facilitate a more sustainable approach to delivering global water, sanitation, and hygiene services in schools. One quick note before we start, this paper has been published and it is free for everyone to access. So if you Google this title, the PLOS One journal link should lead you right to it. So access to safe and reliable water services remains low in LMICs, or low and middle income countries. Globally, 1 in 3 people lack access to safe drinking water. More than half of the global population lacks access to safely managed sanitation services, and over 3 billion people lack access to basic hand washing facilities. What you're looking at here is a map illustrating the modeled proportion of the population without access to a hand washing station with soap and water. Now, in countries shaded in yellow, orange, and red, more than half of the population lacks access to this basic service. Improving WASH access often takes shape in the form of new infrastructure investments. Schools are often recipients of these infrastructure investments because they are a critical institutional setting. Students spend a significant portion of time in classrooms. They are more vulnerable to infections than adults, and they also can spread pathogens to other household members. Delivering programs through schools can therefore be a cost-effective alternative to targeting individual households, especially in sparsely populated areas. Now, improving WASH access will require the construction of new infrastructure, but construction does not guarantee reliable service. If we want to ensure sustainable and reliable service, the physical infrastructure must be well maintained, and the consumables necessary to properly use the infrastructure, such as soap and water, must also be consistently provided. However, evidence suggests that it is challenging to sustainably deliver WASH services in schools. A variety of studies estimate that 33% or more of WASH infrastructure is non-functional at any given time. And so well-intentioned and well-funded projects start off like this, but quickly end up in a non-functional state on the right. The challenges associated with delivering sustainable WASH services have been well established, but there's much less evidence around how to successfully tackle them. Prior research has concluded that the key reasons for unsustainable WASH service delivery include limited budgets and resources, irregular monitoring and oversight, unreliable water sources, and ineffective accountability systems. But recent interventions that have targeted these barriers alone or in combination have had mixed results at best. Given these mixed results, our team wanted to better understand the necessary and sufficient conditions for sustainable WASH service delivery in schools. We drew on literature published over the last 20 years to, 1, synthesize the evidence around the enablers and barriers to sustainable service delivery, and 2, to examine how effective previous implemented interventions have been at delivering sustainable services. Our third objective here was really trying to identify the critical knowledge gaps and intervention priorities in this space. This slide shows how we filtered for the relevant studies in our systematic review, but in the interest of time, I'll invite you to check out our paper for more details about how we approach this project. So after screening over 3,800 articles, we arrived at a set of 19 final studies. 10 of these were experimental studies that tested a specific intervention, and 9 of these were observational studies, which shared the broad objective of identifying the enablers and barriers associated with sustainable service delivery. Today, I will share 4 main findings from our analysis. First, the majority of interventions had negligible sustainability. Interventions in our systematic review range from providing financial support in the form of cash transfers and free supplies, to constructing new infrastructure and providing free rehabilitation services, and to providing free trainings, checklists, and worksheets to build capacity. Interventions focused on improving the regular provision of consumables increased the availability of soap, but had limited impact on the availability of water for hand washing and drinking. Discouragingly, interventions focused on improving the maintenance of infrastructure had limited impact on the accessibility, the cleanliness, and the structural integrity of latrines and water source pumps. Collectively, the literature included in our systematic review suggests that most efforts to improve the sustainability of WASH service delivery in schools have failed. This conclusion holds true for both interventions that deliver financial resources alone and for multi-component interventions that provided cash transfers, new infrastructure, and training for teachers, as well as monitoring checklists. Our second key finding was that observational studies emphasize different system needs than experimental ones. In our experimental studies, interventions included at least one of the following components: providing physical infrastructure such as hand washing facilities, providing consumables such as soap or cleaning supplies, or providing financial resources. These intervention components differ from the key barriers identified in observational work. In observational studies, authors consistently attributed the lack of sustainability to unclear information about maintenance responsibilities, the lack of enforcement of existing maintenance policies, and the lack of authority that teachers had to make maintenance-related decisions. Now, if we take a step back and abstract one level higher, we see that most of the interventions developed and tested experimentally focused on increasing the financial and material resources available to schools. By contrast, all of the observational studies identified weak accountability and information mechanisms as the drivers of school wash service delivery failures. So why does this difference exist? One explanation is that many of the observational studies were actually ex post evaluations of resource enhancing interventions that yielded disappointing results. So someone implemented an intervention that was only focused on resources. Wash service delivery did not improve as anticipated, and a team of researchers came in to follow up and understand why. And those investigations revealed the importance of information and accountability mechanisms, which were areas that were not originally intervened on. We see similar findings reflected in experimental studies. Several experimental studies did acknowledge the role that information and accountability played in a well-functioning wash service delivery system. But ultimately, these interventions did not include components that addressed those two types of supports. Informed by these findings, we hypothesize that there are three simultaneously necessary components of a sustainable wash service delivery system: adequate resources, timely and credible information, and functioning accountability systems. When I say resources, I'm talking about the human, the financial, the physical, and the natural assets required to support the system. A functioning information sharing mechanism is one that delivers timely, credible information that individuals need for effective decision-making. For example, this could include information about the status of the system, or about one's roles and responsibilities, and maybe consequences for failing to meet expectations. In our framework, we define functioning accountability mechanisms as measures that confront individuals with meaningful incentives and consequences for their choices and behaviors. None of the studies that we reviewed intervened in all three domains simultaneously. Interventions that targeted accountability mechanisms were particularly rare. This wasn't too surprising because effective accountability mechanisms are demanding to develop, and they often require skill sets, disciplinary perspectives, and local expertise on sociocultural and institutional norms that are not featured prominently in the WASH field to date. At the same time, the results of our review suggest that continuing to just focus on resource-only interventions are unlikely to yield meaningful gains in sustainable WASH service delivery for schools, unless and until interventions also address information needs and the formal and informal incentive structures that shape individual behaviors. They will likely fall short of achieving sustainable impact. So where do we go from here? Well, for one, we need to think more about information flows. Where are the existing information bottlenecks that are preventing sustainable service? What types of information would be useful to collect? To whom or what entity should this information be delivered? Once we have a better understanding of system needs, we can then think about what are cost-effective strategies to deliver such timely and credible information. There's currently a lot of excitement around sensor and remote sensing technologies that provide real-time updates about the status of wash facilities and supplies. Those technologies hold a lot of promise here. Information systems don't necessarily need to be high tech, but they need to get the right information to the right people at the right time. Once you collect and deliver the information, you'll need functioning and effective accountability mechanisms to ensure that the information generated will actually be acted on. So the individuals that receive the information must be incentivized to consider it. There's a wealth of ideas in social psychology, public management, political science that could be really useful here. And within those circles, we see that the effectiveness of accountability mechanisms depend on 4 key attributes. This idea of timing, whether an individual expects to be held accountable before or after decision making. Source, the party or parties to whom one feels accountable. 3, salience, the extent to which individuals are held accountable for outcomes that they perceive to be important for achieving the overall goal. And 4, the standard, whether individuals are held responsible for processes or outcomes. These considerations are a reminder that we should really think about alternative institutional arrangements for watch service delivery in schools. Current approaches to service delivery often rely on uncompensated volunteers, both as individual champions or members of school or health committees. But these individuals lack the resources, the authority, the political support, and incentives to hold important stakeholders accountable. And so we've set up a system where those expected to demand accountability from service providers often have the least agency to do so. Contracting out maintenance could present advantages here. I'm sure there are many other options. And moving forward, it would be productive to assess the conditions under which these different service delivery models are able to establish effective information and accountability mechanisms. An important part, of course, is thinking about how these models compare with respect to economic and political feasibility. One thing we really tried to do is make this framework simple. We thought about the important causal conditions identified by studies in this review, what they represented, and distilled them into 3 system components that we hypothesize are simultaneously necessary. We are advocating for a systemic process of understanding the system using these lenses, but we're not advocating for generic solutions. With this framework, we're trying to promote the idea of best fit approaches because what the resource, information, accountability needs are will differ by different contexts, and local expertise will be essential to operationalize these concepts. With that, I would love to thank my co-authors on this paper and the funders that supported this work. We've taken these findings to design an operation and maintenance intervention that we're currently scaling and testing across 200 schools in India with World Vision and RCT. If you would want to get in touch, have any questions about the presentation, or want to chat more about this framework, I would love to connect. My email is here, and thank you all for your time today.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was a great presentation from Christine. I'm pleased to know that Christine is here to join us. And Christine, thank you very much. If I could just ask you, is Christine, are you able to hear us?
Yes.
Perfect. Great to see you. Thank you very much. Just wanted to ask you, I mean, it was a great presentation, and I think you really highlighted sort of the 3 kind of, at least for us, very in a nice way to understand these sort of 3 key blocks around resources, information, and accountability. Anything in the presentation did you want to maybe further elaborate on that you felt maybe, because it was pre-recorded, and I think that was great, but was there anything else you would like to elaborate on now reviewing that?
You know, I would say that maybe the part that we don't often get to share in that formal presentation is that this is really difficult and challenging to do, right? So what we're asking folks to think about here is, you know, going from first principles rather than perhaps building on existing interventions or existing programs and tweaking small bits. And a big part of that is us wanting to be conscientious of what's not working. And it often takes a lot of time to figure out what's not working. It often takes a lot of expertise and folks, you know, in governance versus folks in finance, you know, working together. And I know that time and money and resources are luxury. And so, you know, we wanted to put forward this framework not to dismiss the great work that's being done, but if we're, you know, applying the same programs and not seeing the results that we want to see, then maybe it does it does make sense to kind of start from ground zero and think really like
Mhm,
on the accountability issue, what is and what isn't working, on the information flows, what is and isn't working. And of
mhm,
course, that process of iterating and trying to find what that looks like is very
mhm,
humbling. And, we put out this framework and then we talked about moving forward and implementing a project in
mhm,
India. And we have certainly learned a lot in
mhm.
what it means to walk the walk and actually go through this process ourselves.
Yeah, with that, can you share a little bit about, so you mentioned in the presentation that you are working in about 200 schools, which is amazing amount of schools. So where exactly is that in India, and what have been sort of those best fit kind of learnings you've got from India?
So we're working in Uttar Pradesh in India. So it's
Okay.
northern India. We're working in an area called Sitapur. It's a rural
Hmm.
area, and we're working in 5 different blocks, which is kind of
Hmm.
the relevant administrative unit. We
Hmm.
actually piloted some of this work and did our formative research in 2 to 3 other separate blocks. And so we
Okay.
went in with a bunch of social scientists
Hmm.
to speak with teachers, students, block level, education administrative folks to try to understand what's not working. Right. So we
Hmm.
went in with this
Hmm.
2 questions. One, how is it supposed
Hmm.
to work? How is it designed to work with respect
Hmm.
to maintenance requests, water and sanitation, governance, and then the realities of how it's actually working. And
Hmm.
taking this multi-stakeholder approach, I think we learned a lot about um, for example, teachers wanting to um, feeling very excited and responsible for maintaining kind of the water and sanitation facilities for the students, but not always having authority or having the
Hmm.
resources to do so, and also balancing that on top of all of their other educational responsibilities.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
one takeaway that we had was actually to think about outsourcing. So we're
Hmm.
testing this intervention where we're outsourcing the maintenance component by engaging in, quote unquote private sector, but is just someone that is
Hmm.
being
Hmm.
compensated to come in, and that's their sole responsibility, is to think about the maintenance, is to alert the headmaster when something is missing, and that person
Hmm.
shows up at the school for 2 hours a day.
Okay.
And it seems simple, right? But I think what we're
Yeah.
trying to understand is, does that really work, right? Introducing an
Hmm.
external party in a government
Hmm. Hmm.
system, how does
Hmm.
that interact, and where are the resources going to come from? So
Hmm.
we're still learning a lot. I think we've done 2 rounds of data collection. We don't have conclusive results to share just yet, but do
Hmm.
send me a note for anyone who's interested in connecting. And
Yeah.
happy to share results as they come out. But I would say uh, the process of designing that intervention and even implementing an intervention, as folks who aren't typically in the maybe space, has been great, and we really wouldn't have been able to get here without this amount of country support that we've gotten. So we're very grateful for our
Mhm,
partners on the ground
mhm.
as well.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Yeah, and I think with that, actually, there's like a question from Giri, my colleague. Giri is in Nepal, and Giri has a question. So he's saying that, do you think these 3 pillars work without capacity?
Mm.
Or how do you see the role of local capacity in your framework? And actually, that's very similar to what I was going to say. You were talking about the blocks, and I was curious to even see between the 5 blocks you were working, was there actually differences in the capacities between the blocks? So maybe you can kind of add those questions too. Thanks.
I love this point because I think the entire framework depends on local capacity, right? So in some ways, what we're trying to do is hone in on, from in one block, as you're mentioning, Belinda, maybe the accountability mechanisms are really strong, but what's
Hmm.
lacking are the formal information flows about when something is missing, or if the soap is missing, what's the next best place to get it from.
Hmm.
And so when we think about local capacity, I think that very much comes in on the accountability side, and it very much comes in on the information side. Resources is also somewhat capacity, right? Like they're the
Hmm.
human resources aspect, but they're also the natural resources that do or don't exist, or
Hmm.
the types of funds that flow and don't flow. Um, what we're, for us, we're really hoping that this framework is adopted by implementers on the
Mhm.
ground as well as implementers that are funding projects, right? So the next time you're working with someone and trying to develop a project, trying to assess local capacity first, and then
Mhm.
trying to understand how can we bolster it and where are the missing areas. I love that point though, because it can't happen without local expertise. Our team coming in would have had a very different idea of what the intervention looked like compared to spending 6 to 9 months really getting our hands dirty and trying to understand why isn't the existing system working or not.
Mhm. Great. And we got a great question for, I would think it's Ibo from Philippines, Ibo. And he's asking a little bit more about, you mentioned the idea of remote sensory as a ways to in the monitoring. And so therefore, how these are, however, often high tech and require constant power, as in, and internet and all of this. Can this be combined in school settings, and where are the challenges? So, are you at any point doing any of these remote censoring? Is that in your
It's not in our intervention, but it's a great
okay.
point. Personally, I think very great systems don't have to rely on high tech, right? So in
Okay.
our particular system, our information flow isn't a sensor. It's actually this individual who's facilitating or taking that responsibility on to pass on the information to a decision maker. Now, there's a lot of interest right now in remote sensing and sensors that
Hmm.
look at toilet
Hmm.
use or, absence of soap.
Exactly.
Um,
Hmm.
we're excited about those things, but it's very much the case that they're not going to be appropriate for all settings. In the settings where that's not feasible, not even just from an operation perspective, but they're also very expensive, right? So the likelihood of schools being
True.
able to purchase sufficient of them may not always be the case. When I talk about information flows, I think the most important thing is what is the right information that we need? Who needs to have that information? Um,
Hmm.
and what is the appropriate time at which that person can
Hmm.
receive the information.
Hmm.
So there's so
Hmm.
many different ways to transmit that, right? Mobile phones may be a more
Hmm.
appropriate or accessible
Hmm.
way to do it, but those are the
Hmm.
three things I would really focus on. Who needs
Hmm.
to know this information? When does that
What?
information need to get delivered? And what is the information that's needed? And that
Yeah.
can come through high tech solutions, but it doesn't have to at all. But I
Yeah.
appreciate it being brought up.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I think again, exactly. It doesn't need to be so. That sort of the low tech way, the who, what, and timing is key. Great, super clear. And so with that, I think if there's any additional questions, people can put it on the chat. Christine, thank you so much for sharing. I think there's a lot of interest, at least from our side, and you will see in the next coming presentations how this kind of thought is gone continues through. So thanks again so much. All the best, and let's keep in touch.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you. So Fred, then back to you, Fred and Marge, who are in the Philippines. Thank you so much for being in the back end of all of this and helping out. So the next presentation, I'm so pleased to introduce Brooke Yamakoshi. She is in the UNICEF East Asia Pacific Regional Office. She's based in Bangkok. She has worked with UNICEF for over a decade. I can't believe that, but in a number of different roles. The Pacific Islands, where she was, and she's also worked in the headquarters with UNICEF. And before joining UNICEF, she worked with the African Water Resource Management Unit of the World Bank. She is an engineer. She holds an MSc in engineering plus a BSc in civil engineering. So with that, Brooke will take us through the presentation on the Enabling Environment Framework and Matrix. So with that, next slide, please.
Hi everyone, I'm Brooke, and I would like to share some lessons from using the Washington Schools Enabling Environment Matrix. Before I start, I want to acknowledge that this work that I'm going to be sharing today has been done through the Washington Schools International Learning Exchange, which many countries participate in, and coordinated by different agencies working together, which you see at the bottom of the screen. So the International Learning Exchange for Washington Schools, this logo that you see at the top right-hand part of the screen, this is an annual or mostly annual event that convenes ministries of education together with stakeholders working on water, sanitation, and hygiene from across South Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific regions in order to take stock of Washington School status in all of the different countries. As the name implies, the International Learning Exchange facilitates learning, generates momentum, and is also aimed at getting political commitments to achieve the Washington School specific targets under the Sustainable Development Goals, which are under their targets specifically under SDG 4 on education, that are also cross-referenced by SDG 6 for water and sanitation. You see in the top right that there was a virtual 9th Washington Schools International Learning Exchange that was last year in 2022. So 9 ILEs have been held since the first one, which was in the Philippines in 2012. And what I'd like to share with you today is a self-assessment tool that governments and other actors can use together at the national level to review progress in critical areas that will unlock this sort of universal access to Washington schools in line with the SDGs. And this is known as the Enabling Environment Matrix. I know maybe we need a catchier name. That's how you can tell we're a bunch of technical people. So the spirit and principle of these Enabling Environment Matrices is country ownership. I mentioned stakeholders coming together at the national level. Usually that is done through National Washington Schools technical working groups that would come together in the lead up to the International Learning Exchange or on any of their own schedule at national level to assess their progress and then set goals for the coming year. And these are presented and shared during the ILE. So here on this slide, you can see just a quick overview of the regional situation. Since I work in our UNICEF's East Asia and Pacific Regional Office, I did want to share the status of Washington schools across the region and in the different subregions. So the main message here is that the East Asia and Pacific region, while there's been a lot of progress made, the region is not on track to achieve universal access to basic wash services in schools. About a third of the schools in the East Asia and Pacific region overall lack basic wash services, while less than half of the schools in the Pacific Islands subregion have basic wash services. You can see here these are trend graphs. So the blue or green lines is the level of coverage of basic services. So you can see here, for example, on the left under East Asia and Pacific, is the level of basic drinking water, which looks to be remaining stagnant or perhaps declining ever so slightly, around 74%. And this would need to increase dramatically, actually, because it's stagnant. We don't have a multiplier that this would need to increase by, but you can see that this progress needed is this blue triangle, which would need to increase dramatically. Similarly, on sanitation, basic sanitation in schools, this has increased from 2015 level of 61% to an estimated 66% in 2021, but would need to accelerate by 4 times in order to achieve the SDG target. Okay, so let's come back to take a deeper dive into what we mean by the enabling environment. So the enabling environment of the water and sanitation sector, which is also quite comparable to many functions for the education sector, when we refer to the enabling environment, we're really referring to this set of interrelated sector functions that enable the government and different service providers or partners, whether they're different public partners at different levels or private partners, to engage in sustained and effective, in this case, Washington Schools service delivery. So in the context of Washington Schools, this enabling environment is one between the education sector, led by the education sector, but jointly with other sectors that may be responsible for various aspects of water and sanitation service provision, to create the conditions for a country to have sustainable and at-scale wash services, of course, covering all schools. So to better understand and assess the enabling environment, the wash sector typically uses 5 building blocks. And these are the ones that you can see in the inner gold box of this framework. So these are what's marked as governance functions in the wash sector. And these 5 building blocks have kind of been promoted through the Sanitation and Water for All partnership, so they may be familiar to some of you. So you can see over on the left in red that we have sector policy and strategy. So for instance, this would be the different policies that are setting priorities for implementation and then get reflected through laws and regulations This is usually at the national level and maybe in the education sector, or as I mentioned, maybe in health or other health or WASH sectors. In blue next to that, you can see institutional arrangements. And this includes things like sector coordination, the service delivery arrangements themselves, as well as regulation and accountability. And these are all kind of grouped together under this function. When we talk about functions like coordination or service delivery arrangements, this could be at the sector level, it could be at the all the way down to at the school level, or somewhere in between in the maybe at the subnational level, kind of decentralization and the way that that affects service delivery in a given country. Maybe just an example of the sort of really practical level of this is the example that Christine gave of having uncompensated volunteers who are, responsible for different aspects of service delivery at the school level. And here we would want to ask ourselves whether this is a sustainable or fair or effective way of carrying out this sort of service delivery. In purple in the middle, you can see sector financing. So this includes both budgeting, so that's how much money is allocated to the sector, and then how much is spent and where, as well as the financing part, or the ability to raise funds from different sources. Next to that in green is planning, monitoring, and review. And this comes down to being able to collect evidence that is valid, that is reliable, that is timely, and then to be able to use this for decision making. So to get the right sort of information to the right people to influence action, and of course, budget allocation at the national and subnational and the facility level, and kind of tying that loop together. And then on the right, you see capacity development. So this includes institutional and human capacity and competencies to provide WASH services in schools. So what I want to highlight here is that when we look at the three different categories that Christine talked about of resources, first and foremost, we can see here that this enabling environment function, this enabling environment framework includes two functions, which are sector financing, as well as capacity development that deal with resources. One that deals with information here in green, which is about planning, monitoring, and review. And then two that have to do with accountability on different aspects. So sector policy and strategy, maybe how those accountabilities are laid out in sector policies and strategies, and then how they actually work in terms of coordination and service delivery and accountability. So now let's take a look at how this is assessed. So as I mentioned, this is a self-assessment tool that different actors can come together at the national level to assess their progress year to year. So here I've given you an idea of the different questions that the technical working groups are provided with by in this case, the organizers of the WASH in Schools International Learning Exchange, to be able to assess and then compare progress from year to year. So you can see here for policy and planning, for instance, we want to look not only at the adequacy of this dimension, but also the quality. So you see a question here, like, is there a national policy on WASH in schools, which includes gender equality and social inclusion aspects? So this question was actually revised in between 2021 and 2022, because it used to say, is there a national policy on WASH in schools? As we saw that more and more countries were achieving that, almost all countries had a policy that had some specific aspects of WASH in schools or a specific WASH in schools policy. We wanted to actually refine this question a bit more to be able to look at these different quality dimensions. Under budget and financing, you can see here a question like, is there a costing of how much investment is needed to achieve national targets on WASH in schools? And then is there a financing plan that looks at mobilizing funding from different sources? Under monitoring and evaluation, we want to know whether WASH in schools data is reflected in the National Education Information Management System, and whether the definitions are sufficient to enable SDG reporting. So in other words, that graph I showed you on my second slide, is the data collection adequate to be able to produce national estimates that are internationally comparable? But then we also want to know, because we see more and more countries achieving this, is this data feeding into some sort of decision-making process? And is performance, particularly at the school level, but maybe also at the provincial level, subnational level, is performance being acknowledged and rewarded? So do we have an incentive system that's working well? Here you can see the rest of the indicators. So here you see institutional arrangements as well as capacity development. So this covers things like having clear roles and responsibilities and functioning coordination mechanisms, as well as implementation guidelines, which actually say who should do what at which level, and then what are the sort of accountability mechanisms to make sure that is done. Under capacity development, does the Ministry of Education have a plan or strategy for human capacity development for Washington schools that is regularly reviewed? And then again, being able to look at some of the quality aspects of this. So now I would like to show you name blind, so no country names, an example of the sort of assessment that we saw from country technical working groups in 2022. So first we can see that generally the existence of policies and guidelines are bright spots, with many countries up here saying that is on track. But at the same time, we can see that some of the budget issues, as well as the monitoring and evaluation issues, seem to show less progress towards the indicators. But there were still some good practices that came out. So for example, a certain country is targeting resource allocation to schools that currently have no services. So this shows a good example of using data for decision making, while another country is looking at how to mobilize funding through the Global Partnership for Education for Washington schools. Finally, I would like to focus and give a couple of concluding remarks about what some of the bottlenecks are, because of course, the whole point of doing this exercise is to understand what are the weak aspects in the systems that deliver services that countries need to then focus on in order to unlock better progress. So first, I want to preface this by saying that there were many good practices and an encouraging number of countries that have Washington schools reflected in their policies, that have implementation guidance, and are monitoring Washington schools through their education management information systems. But I would also like to just focus on a couple of the weaknesses that seem to be kind of persistent year on year. So I think the first point is that we see good progress, I think in recent years, very consistently good progress on some of the normative aspects at the centralized levels. So this is things like having national policies or standards or guidelines at the national level. But I think when it comes down to looking at what are the bottlenecks to actually translating those into progress on the ground, there's a couple of things that stand out. So first of all, again, at the national level, many countries have clear Washington schools targets. So how are we going to achieve universal coverage? What are our targets year to year? But fewer countries have done a costing on how much funding is needed to achieve the targets. So that comes back to the resource question. Without a costing, many countries then did not have a clear financing plan that looks at different types of sources that would be actually sustainable. And I think we heard some examples of what unsustainable resourcing would be, or one-off resourcing from Christine's presentation. And what we really want to focus on is sustainable sources of funding that are going to be there through government systems from year to year. Many countries also lacked a way of prioritizing the most schools that are kind of falling behind, or the poorest or most remote schools, for greater budget allocation. Finally, on monitoring, we saw that while progress, like I said, continues on monitoring Washington schools through the EMIS, there is less progress on using this data for decision making and for providing recognition and incentives to high-performing schools, or schools that, or districts or provinces that are perhaps most improved or making the most rapid progress. With that, I think that maybe my last point is that this enabling environment matrix can be used to give good insights to technical working groups about what actions they should prioritize for the coming year. And also the process of having an international learning exchange allows countries to share experiences and share good practices and tips with one another on an annual or biannual basis. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone.
So thank you very much, Brooke. Excellent presentation, and thanks for joining us. You're in Bangkok, Thailand. So because we had to do them all pre-recorded, which I actually love because there's no internet issues and everybody can participate fairly. I wanted to ask you, is there anything you would like to elaborate? Maybe like now kind of reflecting back some other points that comes to you now you'd like to elaborate on the presentation, and also welcoming everybody as well to go on the chat box and share any questions too as well to your presentation. Thank you.
Maybe, Belinda, thanks so much. Maybe just one point, which is that this enabling environment self-assessment matrix is meant to be used at the systems level and not necessarily at the facilities level, which is what Christine was presenting, even though there's a lot of parallels in the essentially what's needed in those two systems, if you're looking at it at the school level or at, a subnational level or at the national level. So not quite the same, but in terms of granularity and the specific measures that you would need to take, but somehow related. And I think still kind of a useful comparison between the two. So yeah, I think that's the only other point I wanted to add. Thanks.
Oh yeah, thank you. Thank you. Good point. And when you look at it, I mean, we talked, it's positive, and I love to see all the way the countries of a national level sort of assess themselves. But do you see any limitations to this as this matrix?
Yeah, maybe I can just talk about 3 limitations. So first of all is about the accuracy all the time. I think this is this is kind of an imperfect qualitative assessment, and it's a self-assessment. And I think that when we have looked back now over the years that we've been using a tool like this, we see that there's been a lot of progress for most countries made, evolving from red to yellow to green, and in some cases to blue, which means the action has been totally completed. But I think, there's a lot of caveats that kind of come with that. And we don't necessarily see that these are unlocking the bottlenecks that would accelerate progress, because we don't see progress towards universal Washington schools accelerating. Of course, that's an imperfect comparison, but I think still kind of interesting to look at. So, the first limitation being that it is kind of a self-assessment. And of course, there's progress happening all the time, but how to really capture that against the indicators. Number 2 is about the indicators themselves, which are definitely imperfect, but trying to, I think, move with evolving best practice and insights that we see, from evidence coming up from country level. And then the third, I would say, is that this is still kind of perceived as a tool that is used in advance of the International Learning Exchange, the ILE. And what, the hope would be is that this is a tool that could be used on some sort of a regular basis by the technical working groups at country level. And I think that the feedback we've gotten is that it is quite useful, but that it feels a bit externally driven, even though the ILE is a country hosted event. So that's something that, I would welcome any reflections from anybody who's attending today on that part. Yeah.
Yeah, great. And I think really linked to the last point is Maeva in Madagascar. Maeva, thank you for joining. And she's asking, do you have experiences from the countries who have used this tool or have updated it? So it's kind of a link to what you were saying, or used it for multi-annual basis. So have you heard of countries using it beyond the ILE or any experiences around that? Even UNICEF country offices.
Yeah, thanks, Maeva. I think that what is really interesting is that, we have had an ILE for several years being like an annual thing. So there have been a lot of countries that have been kind of using this as an annual tool. And I think that the insights are quite interesting. And I wanted to point to the comment that Bella made, which is that this tool facilitates a discussion at country level between, all the different agencies that are part of this
Mhm.
technical working group or otherwise sector coordination mechanism working on Washington schools. So it's an
Mhm.
opportunity to come together around these questions and have a discussion, in some cases
Mhm.
have a debate, share good practices that maybe hadn't been
Mhm.
uncovered before this sort of a meeting, asking
Mhm.
about each one of these questions. And I think we definitely do have, as I was mentioning before, a lot of
Mhm.
improvements that we see from
Mhm.
year to
Mhm.
year of countries going from red to
Mhm.
green, which I think shows that it can be a tool for not only this sort of process, but then also perhaps as an accountability mechanism through the ILE, where countries come with
Mhm.
their progress to share with other countries through the ILE, and then develop their action plan, and then coming back to the EE matrix annually, and the action plan is an opportunity to kind of review that, have a bit of
Mhm.
accountability, and close the loop on who was doing what over that year, and maybe what else
Mhm.
is still remaining that didn't get done yet.
Yeah, very interesting. And I've also seen over the years, and you mentioned it as well, that you've kind of upped the game in terms of the indicators and the questions. So now more reflection on gender gender equality and inclusion and so forth. So this is also something, it's also a tool in some ways is evolving as well. So very interesting. Have you seen it been applied at subnational level? I mean, in your experience, has it been yet applied at subnational level? With a little bit of Jessica.
Good question. I would need to go back and check that because I can't
Okay.
remember off the top of my head. But I know that a couple of countries do have Washington Schools technical working groups at the subnational level, and maybe like I think
Yeah.
Pakistan is one that comes to mind. I know there's been
Okay.
a few large countries that do have that. So I think that the same
Right.
sort of process would apply.
Yeah, because I do know we have a lot of people who are joining, even with government or subnational level, so they would probably be interested. But it's been more used. And last question, I think, should be around this E. Maybe sure I'm looking at it really. I think it's really around the question, the indicators, the color coding scheme, and let me just try to read it. And what do you think of socialize the topics?
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. So it's
Ma-
quite a question, but maybe you have a quick reflection on it on the
Yeah, I
chat
think,
box.
I mean, this is a good question. Yeah, and this comes back to the point that Belinda was just also making, which is that over time, if everything looks green in the matrix, but the rate of progress at national level, you remember I showed that first slide,
Exactly.
which shows that our region is kind of stagnant. So if everybody's going to green, but then we're not seeing acceleration, then we have to ask ourselves, are these really the right bottlenecks or questions to be
Mhm.
asking and facilitating this discussion around? So I think this is a really good question.
Great
We
point.
don't want to see, the point is not to, see countries go from green to back to yellow or to red, but it's rather to help us think about, what are the different aspects that are maybe compromising quality or preventing expansion of services in the
Mhm.
same way that, in line with
Mhm.
country targets. Yeah.
No, well said, and a nice way to sort of close our session here. But it's super, super useful for you to take us through the tool. And I think for me, I mean, I've been using the tool for a long time, but I've learned a lot actually from this presentation. So I really do appreciate that. Thank you. And if there's more questions for Brooke, feel free to put them in the chat. Thank you very much, Brooke, for joining us
Thanks,
again and
Belinda. Thanks,
for an
everyone.
excellent presentation. Great. So then with that, we go into our last presentation from Lucy Leclerc. Lucy is, I should say, a WASH all-arounder expert with 12 years experience in international cooperation and 10 years in the WASH sector, focusing on capacity building, governance, and system strengthening. And also, I was pleased when some of our prep work before to learn that she's done a lot of work on integrity tools too, so accountability. So it all flows really nicely. Since 2017, she has been working as the regional advisor for the Swiss Water Sanitation Consortium, and she's been leading exchanges and experience with project teams in Eastern Africa. And I think some of the team's members are here today. I saw Idris, but Idris is not in, he's in West Africa and others. So we're glad to have you here. And back to Lucy, she has a MSc in International World Development from Ghent University in Belgium. So with that, we go to Lucy's presentation on how the EE matrix is applied in the Blue Schools evaluation. So, Fred. Next slide, please.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lucie Leclerc. I'm the Regional Advisor for the Swiss Water and Sanitation Consortium. I'm very pleased to be invited today to present a practical example on how the NGO sector can use the enabling environment metrics for evaluation of projects. The Swiss Water and Sanitation, what is it in a nutshell? So basically, it's a consortium of Swiss NGOs working in the wash sector. It's a big program co-funded by SDC that started already in 2011. We are now entering in our phase 4, and phase 4 should normally last until 2027. The whole idea is that by collaborating, by exchanging, by learning from each other, by fostering this joint work between the different projects and organizations, we improve the way we work and we increase our impact. The focus areas since phase 3 have been working on WASH in institutions, so in school and healthcare facilities, through the implementation of what we call signature approaches. And this is WASH Fit for WASH in healthcare facilities and Blue Schools for WASH in schools. We've also been working on system strengthening and advocacy through since phase 3, but now for this new phase, it is really at the core of our strategy. What is Blue School? Very shortly. So basically, Blue School is an approach that supports improvement in WASH and on environmental conditions in school. The focus is also on climate resilient solution for WASH, but also a bit beyond through school gardens, solid waste management, and other environmentally friendly activities. It is also about promoting practical education and actions on hygiene and the environment. So there are different components. So the usual WASH components that you can see represented here, but also menstrual hygiene and health, school gardening, solid waste management, and environment more broadly. There's been support materials that were developed by Swiss consortium partners and other organizations such as AWAC and ERA, basically to support and inspire systems actors to implement the approach. At the core of this, what we call the Blue Schools Kit, are the catalog of technology and practical exercise. And the whole idea is to basically provide inspiration and not how to do, but really provide inspiration for systems actors on what practical and low-cost action they can implement in their schools on those different topics. Important to mention here is that there is no question WASH needs WASH practices, WASH infrastructure. This is really a basic requirement. It's really the starting point of Blue Schools. So we are not talking about school gardens before those WASH needs are addressed. And then once this is done, then depending on the school's unique context, their specific needs, then other activities can be implemented. Focus on practical action, so really putting the teachers on the driver's seat with the idea that they get inspired to teach in a more practical way activities on WASH and environment, so really complementing the national curriculum rather than adding on additional workload. So the key word is really inspiration and not imposing. And of course, working on alignment. So this is not a new approach. The idea is not to introduce a new approach in schools. It's really much more to align with what's in the national level policies, existing programs, as well as the school curriculum. If you want more information on the Blue Schools, please don't hesitate to contact me, or please go on the Swiss Water and Sanitation Consortium website or on our YouTube channel. So in phase 3, basically Blue School has been implemented in 9 countries in over 150 schools. And in phase 2 already, there were some projects who had also piloted the approach. So it's the right moment now that we are starting with phase 4 to really look at what have been the experience in implementing the approach, how relevant it is, learning from what has worked and what has not worked. And this is the reason why the Swiss Water and Sanitation Consortium embarked in what we called evidence building strategy. So for that, we commissioned different evaluations at project level. And in particular, what I want to highlight today is the in-depth evaluation that was carried out by a consultancy company called Management for Education in 3 different countries, Cambodia, Ethiopia, and Madagascar, in 60 schools in total. And what's unique about the way this evaluation was done is the framework that was proposed. So basically, initially, the consortium, we expected in-depth evaluation using and following the OECD DAC criteria, but the consultancy team suggested to actually use the enabling environment metrics. So it doesn't mean that the enabling environment metrics replaced the classic criteria for evaluation, but more that the questions from those standard criteria would be embedded within the EE metrics, and that the EE metrics would be used to basically collect the information and present the findings. So in terms of how findings were then presented, using then those EE metrics key areas, then the consultant also presented the results using a SWOT analysis. So for each of the key areas, highlighting the strengths of the project, weaknesses, opportunity, and strengths. What were the advantages and limitations of using such a framework? So starting by the advantages. So basically, it's really a new way of thinking that forces you to fully align with the national system, rather than looking only at what the project has achieved or not achieved. I mean, of course, in a standard evaluation, you also have to reflect on alignment with national systems through coherence, sustainability. But here it's really by organizing it through those different key areas, you really always have to keep this in mind, and any recommendation have to go in that direction. So it's a different way of thinking. It's also a different way of structuring the findings, really looking at those building blocks for system strengthening, which one are stronger, which one are weaker. So that really can also help identify for next phases intervention for system strengthening. And it's also a different structure that will facilitate the dialogue with systems actors and government stakeholders, because this speaking a similar language as them, and most of them are already familiar with those building blocks or key areas. So this is when it comes to the advantages. For the limitation, I mean, it is quite complex. You're trying to evaluate a whole system. So it's about finding the balance between breadth and depth. It also requires the consultants to really have an in-depth understanding of the system. So policy framework, mechanisms, rules at different levels. Otherwise, you remain with very general recommendation. And it also requires some openness from the donors, because we all know NGO sector, we often have to carry out those standard evaluations. Donors are expected to also have a chance to read it, and this is really a different way. So this also requires validation from that side. So after reflecting with the consulting team, what we came up with as a conclusion is that maybe for final evaluation, that was maybe a little bit complex, but such an approach, such a framework would be very well adapted for participative midterm review. So basically midterm review that you would do with government stakeholders or systems actors to help you validate findings from the ground, to help you identify system strengthening interventions, and also to give you a bit of a direction on what works well, what can be improved. And then afterwards, more in-depth evaluation might need to be carried for those specific areas that maybe are a bit weaker. Maybe sharing with you some general findings from this in-depth evaluation for Blue Schools. I mean, what came out very clearly is that Blue Schools, and it's also at the core of the approach, the strongest key area was really on capacity development. And when we were a bit weaker was on implementation, arrangement, and monitoring and evaluation. So just maybe to highlight here a difference between using this framework with government stakeholders or with NGOs is that when you would talk about implementation and arrangement, with NGOs, you're more looking at how NGOs have been working through or with government stakeholders. When you talk about budget and finances, how have the NGO project managed to leverage or align with or government funding? So it's a little bit of a different angle to look at it. But when the consulting team came with those general recommendations, it was also clear that, I mean, we had a lot of discussion and there was a missing element to link a little bit those weak points and how to structure the recommendation. And actually, this is where basically the framework from Christine Apou really helped to highlight what was the missing link. And the missing link was accountability. So it's really beyond just monitoring and evaluation. It's really about looking at, first of all, what are the tools, how can those tools be improved, and also how is the information flowing upwards, is it being used within the EMIs, but also how is this information flowing down to the schools and fostering and creating actions at the school level. So it's not just about checklist, it's really a bit broader. And how can NGOs working at local levels support that process? And another aspect of it, which is really key for accountability and which was not identified, or which now we could really highlight using this framework, is the need to really help improve integrity mechanisms. So also about the right holders claiming the rights, the duty bearers feeling that they have the responsibility for fulfilling this. And in the wind sector, this is often a key challenge because you have so many actors and it's not always very clear at local level who should do what. So really supporting that. And as I said before, the flow of information upwards, so upwards accountability and downwards accountability for creating action. And as a last slide here, I would like just to highlight some recommendation, or rather I would call them reflection on what would be the starting point for the NGO sector wanting to work on system strengthening. So it really requires a change of mindset. This was clear from the evaluation. We've learned a lot on that from ourselves, from our donors, but also from the systems actors themselves. Why the donors? Because donors have to be okay that at the end you will maybe reach less beneficiaries if you look at this graphic below at the end of the project. But if you work through a systems approach. But the idea is that on the longer term, you will have a bigger impact. Also because it requires the program to be flexible. I mean, it's very hard at an initial stage of a project to already know what you're going to do in terms of system strengthening. It requires active stakeholders engagement. It might change within the project duration. From ourselves, it also requires a change of mindset because we have to stop this language of we implement, we do, and only thinking of putting our big logo here and saying that this was done by this and this NGO. Sorry, I don't mean to be controversial, but in system strengthening, we have to take a background role. We have to be facilitators. Government stakeholders have to take full lead in any of the activities that are being implemented. And we also have to think a bit in innovative ways. So rather than working in as many schools as we can so that we can claim that we have done a lot and please our donors, we have to more think in a modeling, creating replicable models. So in schools, that would mean maybe working in less schools, but doing it very well together, or aligning fully with doing it together with the government. And then after looking at how can we strengthen government so that they can actually replicate that model? How can we support them in developing local guidelines or mainstreaming those good practices that have been piloted in those models? And a change of language, or the change of mindset, sorry, for the systems actors themselves, because in many cases, what we faced at local level is that systems actors are in some cases fine with the status quo where NGOs come and do the work on their behalf. And this really requires empowerment from the systems actors themselves to clarify what are their duties as duty bearers. And that our role is just to support them in fulfilling their duties, but not to do it for them. So this is where I would like to stop this presentation. There would be much more to say, but I'm still here for questions. Thanks a lot for your attention, and don't hesitate to contact me or my colleague John from the consortium also, or Belinda, who actually was the team leader to carry out this in-depth evaluation on behalf of Management for Education. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucy. And hopefully you are here to join us, since we have two hats here today. Lucy, are you here with us? I know you were having some internet issues. Is she? Maybe she's having some internet issues. Is John with us? Anybody from the consortium? No. Oh, shame. I know she was struggling a lot with her internet, but it was a very great. Oh, you are here! Yay, Lucy!
Hello, Belinda. Hello, everyone.
Yeah, Idris, how are you?
Fine, thanks. And you?
Good, thank you. So we've got Idris as well as Lucy. So Lucy, before Idris, before we go on to you, Lucy, I wanted to ask you if you have an opportunity. Thank you. It was an excellent presentation and really great points to help us bring it down to very practical kind of reflections. And I saw a lot of thumbs up for you. Is there anything you would like to elaborate now watching the presentation? Would you like to elaborate on any point? And then I have maybe one or two questions for you, and then I'll open it up.
Thanks, Belinda. I hope my internet connection will allow me to elaborate. First of all, I want to give the credits to the consultant team that carried out this evaluation for us from Management for Education. So thank you very much for those consultants. You're a part of it. I'd like to maybe come back on the point of change of mindset, because I think that's very important. I mean, most of us, we are, I mean, at least in the consortium, we are WASH experts. And I think it's very important to say that when you start working on WASH in schools, you have to start engaging and working through different systems. Now, the entry point is Ministry of Education. And this is something we really have to get into our mind. We are not going to start by knocking at the door of the Ministry of Water, what we normally do. And on that, we also have to acknowledge that we need to understand the systems ourselves. So we need to analyze the policy document, do a lot of homework so that we are really up to speed. And then you can engage in interesting discussions with the system actors within the Ministry of Education at national or more local level, because that's where we work. But this homework, I keep on repeating it, this is really important. It's quite different from WASH in community, and we need to acknowledge this. So that's one point. Then another point which I keep on highlighting to our teams from the consortium is, because system strengthening, it's becoming really at the core of our strategy. Let's not get overwhelmed. We have to remember who we are. We are NGOs working mainly at local level. Let's start small. We are not going to suddenly go and knock at the Ministry of Education at national level and tell them we can help you improve the policies. Let's just look at what we can do at our local level, and let's do step by step. Oh, I'm not sure if I'm being
No,
heard.
you're perfectly clear. Perfectly clear.
And another key word I would like to highlight, it's let's think of modeling. Let's think of working in less schools, but doing it together with the government through government structure to do it very well and supports the government to replicate. So let's think of model. This could really be a key. This should become a key word in our programming and designing our programs. Maybe another reflection, if I'm still audible, would be on the challenges being presented by Brooke. I find it very interesting that they are very much aligned with the main findings from the global findings from the Blue Schools evaluation using the enabling environment matrix. So basically the fact that most countries have good policies when it comes to WASH in schools, so the framework is there, but that the weak point, it's more maybe on the practical implementation on the ground. And that actually the Blue Schools kit would be one way to help bridging this gap. We had also found that one of the weaker points is mainly on monitoring and evaluation, and also costing and financing. So the findings are quite similar. So I just wanted to highlight this because that was interesting to hear.
Yeah,
Thank you,
yeah,
Belinda.
yeah.
I'll stop here. I could elaborate
No,
more, but I will
no,
stop here.
no, we could hear, I could talk with you all day, you know that. One of the things I find is interesting is the Swiss Water Consortium partners, Helvetas, Caritas, are all signed up under the Agenda for Change, which has 9 building blocks, which are similar. So why do you think this one versus another kind of framework? There are many types of frameworks that NGOs could use and for evaluation, but why did this one kind of resonate with you?
So we could ask the consultant team to respond, but I will try to respond.
Yes, you could ask them, but they're asking you.
Basically, I think, yes, indeed, you're right. There are many frameworks for system strengthening, but some are much more specialized or much more looking at WASH or WASH in communities. What we really like with the consultant team with the Enabling Environment Matrix is, firstly, because it has this capacity building key area, which, I mean, there was a question just before on that. We also agree this is key, and actually that's the strongest point of Blue School, so it was very good to have it highlighted. Rather than the Agenda for Change, IRC WASH capacity building, it's a bit through out different elements, so it's not really highlighted. What's also good about the Enabling Environment Matrix is that this is now a tool that is being used in different global platforms that different Ministry of Education are getting used to using for self-assessment and for monitoring progress. So we thought this would be perfect to align with this, really look at how the NGO sector and other development partner sectors can really align with those efforts at global level directly with Ministries of Education. So those were at least 2 main arguments. But I'd like also to highlight that what we liked of the from the framework of Christine Pou is that talking of accountability, though accountability is part, as Brooke presented, part of institutional arrangement, it's very important to put this also as a separate element, because it really also highlights a key aspect, because when you want to start working on accountability, actually the starting point is, are the duty bearers aware of their duties? And in the wind sector, at local level at least, it's not always the case, because those frameworks, those policies are quite new often. So we found in practice that many of those contact person focal points at local level are not always aware about what they're supposed to do. So then that's why the word accountability is so key to after structure recommendation. And another point on accountability is that it also puts the focus on the right holders. Are the communities aware of their rights? Are students, teachers aware of what they can claim to their duty bearers? And that's something that we NGOs working more at local level can also help strengthen. So in short or long. Thank you.
No, it's excellent. And I think Maeva, again from Madagascar, has, so she says, a good point about the alignment and complementarity of the Blue Schools with existing approaches, I guess, with governments and so forth. Does the model, does the replicable model, is it defined? Is it promoted at national, subnational, local level? So I think in answering her question a little bit about the Blue Schools and how, could you kind of also kind of go into what you plan for the next steps as well with this?
Yeah.
Because you've got now this kind of approach. What is the next steps and how are you working with, which levels of government are you going to work with and so forth?
Yes, thank you, Maeva. This is a very good question, and you touched on one of the discussion points internally of the consortium, because Blue School it's a non-prescriptive approach. It's really much more of a mindset, working on winds first and then environment, as I explained. Actually, there is not one prescribed model of how it looks like. How a perfect school, or let's say perfect winds and environment school looks like will really depend on each context, each school's needs. So we can't really basically define what a perfect school looks like. So it's very context specific. That was the strength of the Blue School approach as identified by the evaluators, but also the biggest, maybe one of the challenge that this brings, this flexibility, this need to contextualize and adapt to the local needs. It also means that, yes, for scaling up, for mainstreaming, it's a challenge, because most people, most governments, most development partners will ask you, what are the steps to implement Blue Schools and how much does it cost? And those are answers that are so context specific that we can't really provide a detailed answer at this. We can't, because we really want to keep this need to localize the approach. And what's the next step for the consortium? Basically, we are very lucky that we have in phase 4, we have a flexible programming. So we are now taking the coming 6 months to really start defining the interventions that we can take when it comes to system strengthening. This intervention will be very country and local context specific. So now the project teams are entering a process where they really analyze the context, engage in discussion with the stakeholders, using the building blocks, looking at where are the points where we can maybe support, also considering who we are, because it's not that we can support everywhere. So really this mapping of the needs and where we can support and defining our intervention is what we are doing right now. And we are very thankful that we have this flexibility to do that rather than just directly starting with procurement and planning infrastructure. No, let's first think of system strengthening and strategize on that.
Perfect, Lucy. Thank you so, so much for your presentation. And if there's more questions for Lucy, you please put them in the box. And yeah, thank you very much. And also when the outputs and outcomes come, please, hopefully you can again share with us these. I think this learning has been fantastic. Bella, I would like to bring you in because there's a couple comments, reflections that you've said, and maybe just to close off the session. Bella, can you join us? I want to bring you in. In some of the preps for this, we had some reflections, and I would like to give you a minute or two to have some reflections on the 3 presentations, or just some thoughts. And I think one thing that sticks to me was a little bit around when we talked about the accountability, the importance of transparency, and just kind of having things out. So I don't know, there's a lot of things, but maybe just to sort of tie in some last points. Could you share with us?
Yeah, sorry, I did not expect, but just to put
I
this
know,
in
I
it
put you
there.
on the spot.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. I think it was a great session. All in all 3 presentations work very, very well to each other. Even Brooke and Christina were suggesting or introducing different frameworks that perfectly link to each other because they also take different cuts for this entire pie, let's say like this. And I mean, looking at the end, what is really, really needed is what I hear also at the end, what we hear from Lucy very clearly is showing what is the role of all the different partners in WASH in Schools. What kind of role do we have and how important it is to align. And I think that's also what we do with this entire WINS network is trying to align strategies, trying to integrate and see what can the different actors, be it the international development partners, be it NGOs, bring up to support the WASH in Schools movement within a country. And what we can also see is the whole way to get governments in the driver's seat, the thing everybody has on their tongue at the moment, using this entire word of government in the driver's seat and system strengthening. What does it take? Of course, it takes that not the NGOs and the development partners do the work of the government, but support them to do it better. And that's also needs a total different approach from the development partner's perspective. And that also needs that we change indicators on how do we need to work, because exactly as it was said by Lucy, it's not about counting the amount of people you have or the beneficiaries. This is not helping for a system strengthening approach. And I think these are all things we have to read. There's a need to revise this, a need to think about how can contribution be measured? Because at the end, you need to measure what did you contribute to, let's say, national goals. Yeah. So what is the way to contribute? It's all more about contribution. And this contribution can only do if you align with other partners within the same direction. And I think this clearly came out in the way Lucy was saying it, and therefore so important to align, not work in isolation anymore. Look what are others doing and try to not compete, but try to align and support the government to do a job. Because look, in the past, it was pretty much on everybody doing their own, a bit in a competitive way, working in silo. And of course, the government had to deal with so many different players. It's so important to try to get to one phase with the government so that it's also easier for them to accept and to take the work and to really be supported by a whole bunch of aligned partners. So perhaps that helps a bit.
Yeah, thank you very much. Close it very nicely. I was just about to type, but my colleague Arn always says we want to create an ecosystem, not an ecosystem. So we need to definitely all work together. So with that, Fred, we can just close it up. We're just a minute over. But just to say that we have an upcoming event. The next one is on the 30th of November. We will be commemorating International Disability. So on the 3rd of December. So we will have a session which will focus on disability and inclusion. We really welcome the participation. It will be coordinated with UNICEF and WaterAid, primarily WaterAid in the projects in Asia and also in Africa. And also, many of you might know the Emory University's WINS distance learning course is now open. It's classes start, it's open for enrollment. Classes start the 13th of January. And just to, again, close it all off, thank you, Christina, Pooh, Brooke, Lucy, thank you all so much for excellent presentations, really getting us to think and to collaborate. And then Bella, your closing words tied it in beautiful together. If you're not already part of the WINS network, please do join. You can go on the QVR code again, and then to the backend team, Marge and Fred, thanks a lot for putting all this together. Have a great day, and let's keep in touch. Until next time, bye-bye.